Name is Hazel Dowd, and I was 32 years old the night my sister stood at a podium in a rented banquet hall in Scottsdale and told 47 people that I had wasted my life. She didn't say it exactly like that. She never does. My sister has always been smart enough to wrap the knife in silk before she slides it in. What she said was, some of us chose ambition, some of us chose comfort. She paused just long enough for the room to feel the weight of it. Then she smiled at the crowd and said, "I'm proud to be in the first group." Everyone laughed. My father laughed the loudest. I was sitting at a round table near the back, next to my aunt in a dress I'd bought on clearance at Target, because I hadn't had time to shop. I'd driven 4 hours from Flagstaff that afternoon. I'd swapped shifts with a colleague the day before and rescheduled 2 home visits for the following week. I'd done all of that to be there, in that room, watching my younger sister accept a plaque for Regional Sales Director of the Year from a pharmaceutical company that paid her $300,000 annually, plus bonuses and a lease on a white BMW. My father walked up to the podium after her. He pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. His hands were steady. His voice was proud. He announced that, effective that evening, he was transferring controlling interest in our grandfather's property, a commercial building in downtown Tempe that had been in our family for 30 years, currently valued at just over $4 million to my sister, exclusively. Because, he said, she had demonstrated the drive and the vision that the family's legacy deserved. My mother stood beside him nodding. She had worn the pearl earring she only brought out for important occasions. My sister took the folder, held it to her chest, and cried exactly 2 tears. Then my father looked at the back of the room, found me, and said, "Come up here, Hazel. Sign the waiver. Make it official." The room turned. 47 sets of eyes, and I felt every single one. My aunt put her hand over mine under the table. Her grip was tight. I stood up anyway. I should tell you what my life actually looked like before that night, because my father's version and the real version are 2 different stories. I'm a hospice nurse. Have been for 6 years, the last 4 of them with a nonprofit agency in Flagstaff that serves rural communities across northern Arizona. My caseload averages 18 patients at a time. I drive a 2017 Subaru Forester with 212,000 miles on it and a crack in the passenger side mirror I've been meaning to fix since last winter. I make $51,000 a year. I rent a 1-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the hospital where I started my career, and my kitchen window looks out onto a parking lot that belongs to a dry cleaner. This is not a sad life. I want to be clear about that. I chose it. I chose it with full knowledge of what it would and would not give me, but I knew how my family saw it. My sister's name is Brooke. She's 28. She drove herself to school events in high school, organized her own study groups, charmed every teacher she ever had, and was accepted to Arizona State on a merit scholarship. My parents framed the acceptance letter. It hung in the hallway for 3 years. My nursing school diploma was congratulated with a dinner at Applebee's and a card that said, "We're happy for you." After graduation, Brooke went into pharmaceutical sales. She was good at it immediately. Within 2 years, she was flying to conferences in San Diego, posting photos from hotel rooftops, texting the family group chat with every award and milestone. My parents screenshot her LinkedIn posts and forwarded them to relatives in the same chain where they still hadn't mentioned that I'd completed my board certification. I stopped expecting them to. The work I did was quieter. There are no LinkedIn announcements for sitting with a 79-year-old man named Harold while he dies, making sure he isn't afraid. There are no conference keynotes for driving 40 minutes in January to change the pain medication schedule for a woman whose family lives in California and can't get there. There is no performance review metric for the specific skill of knowing when to talk and when to just be present. I had learned to stop explaining this to my family. They didn't have a category for it. 18 months before that banquet hall night, I was doing an overnight stay at a patient's home in a small community about 22 miles outside of town. Standard enough, except around 2 in the morning, I noticed the oxygen concentrator behaving strangely. A slight irregular sound, a small pressure fluctuation that wasn't in the normal range. I checked the equipment. One of the internal seals was beginning to fail. Not dangerous yet, but within a few hours it would have been. The nearest equipment provider didn't open until 7. The backup unit I'd flagged for the agency 3 months earlier, the one I'd written a formal memo requesting, had finally been approved and was in my trunk. I swapped the units myself, stayed until 6 to make sure everything stabilized. My patient, a 71-year-old woman named Edna, slept through the whole thing. Her daughter called me the next afternoon from Sacramento crying after I told her what had happened. She said, "I don't know what we would have done." I told her it was just part of the job. My agency director, a woman who doesn't give out praise easily, wrote me a formal commendation letter. My patients' families started sending cards. A few sent small gifts, baked goods, handwritten notes. One woman sent a jar of homemade jam with a card that said, "You were the reason I was at peace when she went." I kept everything in a shoebox in my closet. I never told my parents any of it. What was the point? They would have called it just doing my job. My aunt knew. She always found out somehow. She called me from her house in Tucson the week after the commendation came through and said, "I heard what you did for that family." She's a retired teacher, 64, with a silver braid down her back and the kind of voice that never rises. "You are exactly who you're supposed to be," she told me. "Don't let them make you doubt that." I laughed it off. But the words stayed. 6 weeks before the banquet, an invitation arrived in my mailbox. Thick cream envelope. Family return address. I stood in my parking lot holding it for a long moment before I opened it. My sister's award ceremony. Dinner event. Family attendance expected. I turned it over. Read it again. I knew what I would be at that event. I knew my role. I had been cast in it for years. The cautionary tale. The contrast that made Brooke's success look brighter. I almost threw it away. My aunt called that evening. I don't know how she always knows. "Are you going?" she asked. "I don't think so." "Go if you want," she said, "but know what you're walking into." I put the invitation on my counter and left it there for 2 weeks. Then I got a text from my sister. It came on a Tuesday at 8 in the evening while I was doing paperwork at my kitchen table. "Don't come. You'll make it awkward. You always do." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the table and went back to my paperwork. The next morning, I requested the day off and drove 4 hours to Scottsdale. The banquet hall was the kind of place that gets rented for corporate events. Warm lighting, round tables with white linens, a podium with a company banner. I came in through a side entrance in my clearance dress. My aunt was already there, at a table along the wall, in a navy blouse. No jewelry except small gold studs. She stood up and hugged me without saying anything. We sat together. I watched the room fill with colleagues of my sister's, people from regional offices, a few people I half recognized from family holidays years ago. Brooke walked in like someone who had been practicing walking. Hair blown out, heels, a fitted blazer in deep burgundy. She worked the room before she even reached the podium. Handshakes, hugs, that practiced laugh. Her speech was polished. Metrics, growth numbers, leadership philosophy. Then the pause. Then the line about ambition versus comfort, and the eyes that found me in the back row just long enough to make sure I knew who she was talking about. My aunt's jaw tightened. I watched her keep it together. My father's speech was shorter. He had clearly written it out, was reading from the paper. He called Brooke the embodiment of what the family had always believed in. He talked about the property, 30 years in the family, grandfather's legacy, blah, 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 and announced the transfer. When he looked at me and said my name and told me to come up and sign the waiver, his voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had decided in advance not to feel anything. The waiver was a standard relinquishment form, the kind a family attorney would produce. It was pre-printed. My name was already typed in the relevant field. I walked the length of that room. I heard the conversations go quiet. I felt the specific texture of 47 people pretending not to stare. My father handed me a pen. It was silver, heavy, his good pen, the one he kept in his breast pocket. My mother was standing slightly behind him, looking at the wall to my left. Brooke was beside the podium, arms crossed, face smooth and waiting. I took the pen. I looked at the signature line. I lowered the pen to the paper. And then the side door behind the stage opened. The man who walked in was in his late 60s, heavy set, wearing a gray sport coat that looked like it had been sitting in a car for an hour. He carried a weathered leather portfolio under one arm. He moved without hurrying, which is the thing I noticed first. He wasn't rushing, he was arriving. My father saw him. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. Not anger. Something underneath anger. Something closer to fear. My mother took one step back without appearing to decide to do it. The man, his name was Frank Okafor, and I would learn later that he had been my grandfather's personal attorney for 19 years, stopped at the edge of the stage and set his portfolio on an empty side table. "Apologies for the interruption," he said. He had a low voice, deliberate. "My name is Frank Okafor. I was retained by Thomas Dowd beginning in 2003. My grandfather, Thomas Dowd. The room went the way rooms go when something shifts and everyone feels it before they understand it." Frank unzipped his portfolio and removed a document secured with a binder clip. He held it up without dramatics. Mr. Dowd executed a revised estate instrument 14 months before his death. Notarized, witnessed, filed with Maricopa County Probate. He paused. The original copy delivered to the family following Mr. Dowd's passing was subsequently destroyed. We have a signed affidavit from the paralegal who was present. My mother made a sound that wasn't a word. My father said, "That's not," and stopped. Brooke said nothing. Her arms were still crossed. But her face had changed in some way that I didn't have a name for yet. Frank set the document on the table and opened it. He didn't need to read from notes. He had been carrying this for a long time. Mr. Dowd's instrument supersedes all prior documentation. The Tempe commercial property, the associated trust, and all liquid assets of the estate, total value at current appraisal, $6.2 million, are transferred in full to Hazel Dowd. He let that land. Somewhere in the room, someone's chair scraped back. "The instrument specifies the reasoning," Frank continued. "I'll read it as written. Quote, Hazel has shown in her life and work the values I tried to build this family on. She gives more than she takes. She does not seek credit for it. This is rare. This is what I want the legacy to stand for." My aunt was on her feet. She pointed at my father, not aggressively, just directly, the way someone points when they're done pretending, and said, "That is Thomas's real will. You knew about it. You all knew." My father started to respond. Frank raised one hand without looking at him and kept speaking. He pulled a second folder from the portfolio. He laid documents on the table in a row. The first was my formal commendation from the agency. He had obtained a copy. I didn't know how yet, though I found out later my aunt had sent it to him after she heard about the oxygen concentrator incident. The second was a packet of printed emails. Correspondence between my father and a Maricopa County estate attorney dated 11 days after my grandfather's funeral, discussing the disposal of a document my father described as inconsistent with family intentions. The third was a one-page summary from a forensic document examiner confirming that the version of the will my father had on file, the one giving Brooke everything, had been altered. One clause removed. One beneficiary changed. The examiner's signature was at the bottom with a certification number. Frank didn't perform any of this. He just laid it out. He spoke like someone reading a grocery list, which somehow made it worse or better, depending on where you were sitting. My father's face had gone the color of old cement. Brooke finally moved. She stepped forward and said loudly, "This is a setup. She planned this." Her voice had lost the polish. "She has always been jealous. She has always resented the coercion clause," Frank said, without raising his voice, cutting through her cleanly. He tapped one page. Mr. Dowd anticipated the possibility of pressure being applied to the primary beneficiary. Any attempt to compel a signature under duress activates a contingency provision. The trust releases directly to Hazel without further legal process. He looked at me. "The pen in your hand qualifies." I looked down. I was still holding my father's silver pen. I set it on the podium, not dramatically. I just put it down. My aunt came to the stage. She climbed the 2 steps and stood beside me and didn't say anything more. She had already said everything she needed to say. The room had gone completely quiet in the way that quiet means no one is breathing quite right. Then, one of Brooke's colleagues, a man in a blue blazer at the front table who had been on his phone for the last several minutes, stood up. "Does your family's attorney have copies filed with the court?" he asked Frank. "Certified copies, yes," Frank said. "Filed the morning of the funeral. We anticipated this. My grandfather had anticipated it. I stood at that podium and I thought about him. Thomas Dowd, who had built that property with 30 years of careful decisions, who had watched his son decide that legacy meant money and his granddaughter decide it meant something else, who had sat across from me at his kitchen table the summer before he died and said, 'You do good work, Hazel, the kind nobody puts on a plaque.' I had laughed. He'd smiled. Neither of us said anything else about it. He'd said it onto paper instead, in ink, in front of a notary and 2 witnesses. What happened after is both faster and slower than I can properly describe. My father tried, twice, to speak over Frank. The second time, Frank simply continued reading without acknowledging him, and my father stopped because there is something about a man who will not be interrupted that eventually defeats the person who keeps trying. Brooke walked off the stage. She went to a table, sat down, and stared at the tablecloth. I watched the muscles in her jaw working. She had the look of someone doing math that keeps coming out wrong. My mother stayed near the podium for a long moment, one hand resting on the edge of it, looking at some point in the middle distance. Then she picked up her small clutch purse from the nearby chair and walked out the side door without saying a word. Not to me, not to my father, not to Brooke. The man in the blue blazer from Brooke's company called someone immediately upon sitting back down. I heard the words legal and company policy and prior to any transfer. Brooke had apparently listed the Tempe property as a personal asset in documentation she'd submitted to her employer as part of a compensation restructuring proposal. Frank, who I suspect had been thorough for longer than any of us knew, had anticipated this too. A separate letter in his portfolio went to that man's table directly, addressed to the company's regional compliance officer. I did not know the full shape of what my sister had already done with an inheritance she hadn't technically received yet. I found that out later, in pieces, over the next few weeks. It was worse than I would have expected, and I say that having expected something. My father, when he finally spoke again, said my name. Just my name. The way you say a word when you've forgotten what comes after it. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I'd expected rage or grief or some release. What I actually felt was very quiet. Tired in the cleanest way. "We can talk," he said. "I know we can," I said. I picked up my bag. I walked to where my aunt was standing, and she put her arm through mine, and we walked out together. I want to tell you what happened in the months after, because people always want the accounting. They want to know what the balance sheet looks like at the end. The estate transferred without additional contest. Frank had been thorough in ways I still learn about occasionally. Every contingency addressed, every clause airtight. The $6.2 million became mine to manage, and for the first 3 months I mostly let it sit in an account while I tried to figure out what Thomas would have wanted me to do with it. I knew the answer already. I had known it since I stood at that podium. I spent the following spring working with a nonprofit consultant and 2 other hospice professionals to establish a rural care fund in Arizona. The fund covers equipment costs, mileage reimbursement, and crisis staffing for home hospice agencies in counties with populations under 50,000. In the first 8 months, it served patients in 11 counties. The agency I worked for was one of the recipients. I still work. I reduced my caseload slightly, which I'm honest enough to admit I needed to do, but I still drive out to homes in Flagstaff and a surrounding area. I still have a box of cards and notes from families. It has gotten bigger. I bought a house, small, 3 bedrooms, with a yard that has a single old cottonwood tree in the back that drops leaves all over the patio in October. I don't mind. I drink my coffee out there in the mornings and I find things to do with the quiet. My aunt comes up from Tucson every month or so. We cook, we watch old movies. Sometimes we don't talk much and that's fine. She's the person who sent Frank Okafor my commendation letter, who had kept his number for 14 years after my grandfather first gave it to her, who said to him when she called, "I think it's time." She doesn't take credit for any of it. That's where I get it from, I think. My father called once, 4 months after the banquet. The conversation was short and did not go anywhere productive. He said some things that were apologetic in structure but not in substance. I told him I was fine and that I needed time. Both of those things were true. My sister, I have not spoken to. I don't expect that to change soon. What I keep coming back to, and I've had a lot of quiet mornings to turn it over, is my grandfather at his kitchen table. He was not a sentimental man. He didn't give speeches. He watched people carefully over a very long time, and he wrote down what he saw. He saw me. I spent years assuming that the people who mattered had looked and found nothing worth noting. I made peace with that, or I thought I had. I built a life I believed in regardless, because the alternative was building one for an audience that was never going to applaud anyway. But he had been watching the whole time. I didn't need the inheritance to know who I was. I want to be clear about that. The money is a tool, and I'm trying to use it well. The validation was never the point. But there is something about being seen, finally, after years of assuming you weren't. There is something about that which does not have a clean word. It sits somewhere between relief and grief, because if he could see it, then someone else could have too and chose not to. I think about that sometimes on the patio, under the cottonwood, before the day begins. Then I finish my coffee and go to work. I've thought about that silver pen a lot since that night. The weight of it. How cold it felt. I almost signed. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to tell the story as if I was always going to hold out, always going to trust that something would shift. But the truth is, I was 3 seconds away from putting my name on that line and walking out of that room smaller than I walked in, not because I believed the waiver was fair, because I was tired, because I had spent so many years absorbing the message that my choices didn't count for much, and eventually, that kind of message starts to feel like fact. What stopped me wasn't courage. It was a door opening. But here's what I've come to understand about that night, and about the years that led to it. What Frank Okafor walked into that room carrying didn't appear out of nowhere. My grandfather didn't write what he wrote because he felt sorry for me. He wrote it because he had been paying attention for a long time, and what he saw was a pattern, not a moment. A pattern. Every shift I stayed late. Every family I drove out to at 2 in the morning. Every time I fixed a problem quietly and didn't mention it at Sunday dinner, every piece of that added up somewhere, even when I assumed no one was keeping count. That's the thing about character. You build it when you think no one is watching, and it turns out that's exactly when it matters most. My sister Brooke is smart. I've never doubted that. What she got wrong, what my parents got wrong alongside her, was confusing visibility with value. Brooke's success was loud. It had metrics and magazine features and LinkedIn posts. Mine was quiet. It happened in living rooms and hospital corridors and a parking lot at 2 in the morning while the rest of the city was asleep. And for a long time, I let them convince me that quiet meant less. It doesn't. It just means different people are keeping score. The thing about integrity, actual integrity, not the word you put on a resume, is that it costs something every time. Every time I chose the harder route, the less glamorous shift, the patient who had no one and needed more time than I technically had, I was paying into something I couldn't see and couldn't spend. It felt like nothing. It felt like just doing my job. My grandfather understood that those are not the same thing. And here is what I keep coming back to when I think about Brooke and my father and the whole shape of that evening. The choices they made didn't just hurt me. They hollowed something out in themselves. My father had to look his daughter in the eye and ask her to sign away her rights in front of 47 people. My sister had already borrowed against an inheritance she hadn't legally received. They built their version of the story so carefully, and then one man with a weathered portfolio walked in and the whole thing came apart in under 20 minutes. That's not luck. That's what happens when you construct something on a foundation that was never solid. I don't carry anger about it anymore. I carried it for a while. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But anger at people who are already living with the consequences of their own decisions is just weight you're carrying for someone else. What I carry instead is something Thomas left me that has nothing to do with the property or the trust or the account numbers Frank read out loud that night. It's the knowledge that someone looked at a quiet life, a careful life, a life that never made it onto a billboard, and decided it was the most valuable thing in the room. That's enough. More than enough. It always was.